Planning Committee. I'm Councillor Mike Johnson. I will be chairing today's meeting. This is a public meeting and members of the press and public are permitted to report on proceedings. Reporting includes filming, photographing, making an audio recording and providing commentary on the proceedings. Please note this meeting is recorded and streamed live. These recordings are published on the relevant meeting page of the Council's website. By choosing to attend this meeting, you are deemed to have given your consent to being filmed or recorded and for any footage to be broadcast or published. If the alarm sounds, the premises must be evacuated immediately. Do not spend time collecting personal belongings. All emergency escape routes are clearly signed. Once you have left the building, the assembly point is in the High Street opposite the Guildhall. Members and other speakers are reminded to use their microphone when speaking. Thank you. On to the agenda. Appointments of substitutes.
There are no substitutes, Chair.
Thank you, Margaret. Declarations of interest. Take that as a no. Minutes of the previous meetings. We have 22nd of July, page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Are we happy for me to sign these? Thank you. 29th of July, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, and 8. If you are happy to proceed with those, I have one amendment to make. You will recall that we went into private session, and I would like to add to the minutes at that point where we declare we're going into private session the following words. On a point of clarity, the legal advice that was sought on the reasons for refusal was needed to be heard in private, so the Council's position was not prejudiced and it would be able to defend its position in any subsequent appeal if we had refused the application. Having received the advice, the committee moved quickly back into public session after the discussion where the item was publicly discussed. Are we happy for that amendment? So people are clear? Thank you. Okay. And for speed of, we've got a pink paper which we would go into, unless people have got a problem with it. Are we happy for me to sign the pink minutes as well? Thank you. That deals with item 3. Item 4, Conservation Advisory Committees. We have the minutes of the meeting of the 7th of July. Any comments? The meeting of the 4th of August and the meeting of the 7th of July. And I have been busy, and a meeting of the 4th of August. Oh, I've got that one twice. We'll accept those into the record. Thank you. Item 5, public participation.
No public participation, Chair.
Thank you, Margaret. But we do have public representation in relation to item 9, Rosa Villa. So at this point, I would like to call forward Kevin Ruff and Paul Chambers to the position to speak. But before you speak, I'll ask the officer to present their report. Thank you.
So this application is for a retrospective non-material amendment to application 20/000088/FUL, which was allowed at appeal. To provide some context with regard to the considerations of this application, the application is for a non-material amendment under section 96A of the Town and Country Planning Act. In line with the requirements of this Act, the only matters that we are able to consider are the changes that have been made against what was consented by the inspector and whether the committee consider that these changes are non-material in nature. The accompanying report covers all the relevant issues and is taken as read. There are also no rate papers in respect of this item. I would, however, just like to provide some clarification in respect of figures 2 and 5 of the officer report, which are the images showing the previously approved plans. As the plans have been taken directly from the approved plans, the purple line, which is labelled approved scale, in fact relates to the original planning consent for the erection of a 4-bedroom dwelling on the site and was used to demonstrate the difference in height between the consented 4-bedroom dwelling and the 6-bedroom dwelling that was proposed at the time. This current application for a non-material amendment does not propose any amendments or alteration to the height of the consented dwelling. A number of concerns have been raised during the course of the application in respect of the height of the dwelling as built. The height of the dwelling was therefore checked on site with the planning enforcement officer, and it was considered that the height of the dwelling as built is in accordance with the approved plans. There is now just a short presentation to illustrate the retrospective application. As you will see, the first slide shows the proposed plans that were submitted with the application. This also highlights the location of the dwelling on Nunnery Lane, adjacent to properties Montana and Rose Villa. As the amendments have already been made to the dwelling, we do have the benefit of being able to view the dwelling as built. Therefore, the following next few slides show some photographs taken at the site visit. These show the dwelling under construction. As you can see, this slide shows the side elevation of the building. The next slide shows the neighbouring bungalow property known as Rose Villa to the right of the dwelling. And again, this next slide shows the front elevation of the dwelling adjacent to neighbouring property known as Montana. As you can see, the next slide shows the front elevation of the dwelling as consented by the planning inspector at the top of the slide, with the current retrospective amendments below. Just to clarify that, as previously mentioned, please note the purple line relates to a previous application and does not relate to any height change between the most recent consent and this current application. The changes to the front elevation are outlined in red. These include the alteration of the central first floor window in the front elevation, the omission of the previously proposed chimney to the left of the building, the alteration of the first floor Juliet balcony windows, also on the front elevation, and the alteration of the gable windows. The amendment also relates to the alteration of the front porch. Just as a point of clarification, you may notice an additional red box around the porch is shown on the slide, but not on figure 3 of the report. This red box has just been added just to highlight the changes that have actually been made to the front porch. The next 2 slides show the previously approved retrospective changes on the previously approved plans and the retrospective changes, just as a larger plan for if any members wanted to view the plans on a bigger slide. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. As you can see, this slide shows a photograph of the retrospective changes to the front elevation of the dwelling that is under construction on site. Moving to the changes of the rear of the dwelling, as you can see, this slide just shows the rear elevation as consented by the inspector at the top of the slide, and the proposed retrospective changes that are also below highlighted in red. Specifically, these changes include the relocation of the 5 originally consented Velux roof lights and the introduction of a 6th roof light also in the rear elevation. And again, the next 2 slides just show the plans in a larger form. Next slide, please. As you can see, this next slide just shows the roof lights as they've been erected in the rear elevation of the roof slope. A discretionary 21-day consultation period was carried out and objections have been received from a number of neighbouring properties as detailed in section 6.8 of the report. A number of these objections are regarding the principle of development. However, as mentioned before, the principle of development is not actually a consideration in the determination of this application. So for the reasons set out in section 7 of the report, it is considered that the changes are non-material and would have no impact on the consideration or deliberations made in the original approval given by the inspector. And as such, the amendments are considered to be acceptable and are recommended to you for approval, subject to the condition that is set out in section 8 of the report.
Thank you very much. We have speakers as objectors to the application. Kevin Ruff and Paul Chambers. As objectors, you only get 5 minutes between you. So over to you.
Good afternoon. I'm Paul Chambers and I'm speaking on behalf of my mother, Mrs. Thelma Chambers. She's lived at Montana, which is adjacent to this development, for 58 years. I hold power of attorney as she is an elderly, vulnerable lady and is housebound. We have objected to this development, the development of this land, over many years, and my mother's health has suffered due to the uncertainty caused by a constant barrage of appeals and revisions. We had resigned ourselves to the fact that Montana is now overshadowed by this oversized development and believed that it would be built to the conditions set by the planning inspector and completed quickly. The planning inspector stated, in addition to the standard time condition, I have imposed a condition requiring that the development is carried out in accordance with the approved plans. This is in the interest of certainty. This was referring to Plan I, and we now have Plan M, and building work has continued with no enforcement of the conditions set. The changes made to the building are not minor or non-material by any definition, and it is quite shocking that the planning department recommends granting approval and overriding the planning inspectorate, who are the highest authority. As the conditions set by the inspectorate is being ignored, the proposed amendment attached to condition 2 in section 8 to ensure compliance holds little value, and we are now concerned that even further changes to the development will be made and other conditions may be ignored, including those concerning surface water and mains drainage, landscaping and planting. This is still a designated green space, and recently a mature tree with a TPO was severely lopped and damaged. Further extensions possibly in outbuildings, further loss of light and privacy, traffic safety, parking and road access. We feel that this application should be refused, and the planning inspectorate who set the condition to build to Plan I, in the interest of certainty, should decide the outcome in the inevitable appeal which will follow. 20 years of uncertainty and living next to an unsightly building site is enough.
I
Thank you.
object to the planning application because a number of aspects are actually material changes and as such do not reflect the planning inspectorate's direction that the building should follow Plan I. It is appreciated that the planning process for non-material changes is less onerous than that for full applications. The government do not define non-material and say it is dependent on each planning application. This application refers to alteration of the gable windows. I believe this is a material change as there were no windows on the front of the 3rd floor on the inspectorate's approved Plan I. As a result of the introduction of these windows and the removal of the rear-facing windows on the 3rd floor has changed the aspects of the 3rd floor. I believe this is a material change. The headroom in the 3rd floor bedrooms has increased. This in turn has increased the roof height. I read the planning officer has made measurements, but I don't agree with the assertion that the heights reflect Plan I. Current Plan M contradicts itself. The front elevation shows the height of Plan I. However, the 3rd floor plan view reflects the actual as-built and shows the roof height is higher, as shown in the diagram in my objection, and the photograph in your information pack. In addition, as the roof was installed, it was seen that there is a wide area of flat ceiling on the third floor. The section view in Plan I showed no flat ceiling as the roof height was restricted. These two pieces of evidence show the roof height must be higher than the approved. I believe this is a material change. The house has been plumbed for gas. I read that the agent states that an air source heat pump will be fitted. It would be very unusual for a developer to go to the cost of fitting gas piping for a fire and central heating, to also install air source heat pump as an alternative. I don't believe this is a true assertion of the build and how this property will be used. I believe this is a material change. As there are material changes, then the direction of the inspectorate to build to Plan I is not being followed. I also have concern that the plans are not accurate with errors and omissions. This makes it difficult to properly assess them and to enforce them. As retrospective planning has already been made, I have no confidence that the pre-occupation requirements will be complied with and they will just be removed on future planning applications. Due to the number of material changes, I request this application is not passed.
Questions for the objectors? Councillor Amos.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one question. Did I understand you correctly to say that the building is higher than it was originally?
I believe that it is about 2 foot or 600 mil or more taller than what was actually in the inspectorate approved plan.
No? Thank you, gentlemen. Questions for the officer, but perhaps before, perhaps I could ask Sim as to, this is quite a legalistic sort of process. You want to give us some context?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, 96A applications are basically, as the officer said at the beginning of the presentation, what we're looking at is as to whether or not you need to make a decision as to whether or not you consider that the changes that have been sought, they've put them in place, but they're seeking to regularise those through an application. And your decision today is to whether or not you consider that they are either material to the consideration or non-material. In other words, of such a small change that you're happy to deal with them as a non-material amendment. If you were minded to refuse the application, then basically what you're saying is you do not consider that the application for the change, the amendments are non-material. You think that you consider them to be material. Under the process of the 96A application, there is no recourse for the applicant to appeal against that decision. What the applicant would subsequently then do is submit an application for a material amendment under section 73 of the Act. So you'd get another planning application coming in, and they would say that it was a minor material change. So it would be an application to say that the changes are material, but they're of a minor nature. So it's a procedural thing, but it's actually quite important for the way you consider this, because what you're doing is assessing it as to whether or not you consider it is a non-material amendment or not. Okay. The principle, as the officer said, the principle has already been approved by the planning inspector in granting the planning permission. They've not built it out as per plan, and all that they are doing is seeking to regularise what's being built now, and they're saying it's a minor material, a non-material amendment. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that. 2 questions from me first. There's no definition of material or non-material. And does the planning inspectorate have any force or legal intervention in this process?
There isn't any definition. It's really for members to decide as to whether or not you consider it is a non-material amendment. And if you don't think it is, then you can come to that decision. The planning inspectorate, basically, the way that they've imposed the condition is when we grant permission for something. We grant permission and someone builds out a development having regard to the conditional requirements. If they don't have regard to those conditions and including building out as per plan, they do so at their own risk. The planning inspector are like ourselves, they're basically saying, these are the plans you must build to. If you don't build to them and then it's subsequently you then seek to regularize it and that's not approved, then they're done so at their own risk. The inspector will not look at this and go, well, actually you haven't built out as per our plan. They would just say, there's a way of regularizing it through the application process, and which is what they're doing at the moment.
What's behind my question is, if we choose to refuse this, does the planning inspector have the ability to override our refusal?
No, under the provisions, there isn't the applicant, there's no appeal process behind this because it's not an actual new application. It's a 96A application. So if members are saying, well, we don't think it's a non-material amendment, then they wouldn't be able to go to appeal. All they would do is then say, right, you don't think it's a non-material amendment, and then they would come in to try and regularize it through an application for minor material change under section 73, which is actually a new planning application.
Thank you for that. I think it's somewhat clearer. Questions?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's a couple of questions and comments. Could Mr. Manley confirm that what has now been built is not what the planning inspector gave permission for? That's the first question.
The reason we've got the application is because they haven't built out as per the plans approved by the planning inspector.
Thank you. The next question is then, in terms of materiality, it seems the applicants, well, they're not really applicants, the people who have transgressed the inspector's decision have been quite crafty, because you could argue that each one of these 7 amendments are not of themselves a major issue. However, my argument would be that cumulatively 7 are material if you add the 7 together, because we've got the report is for 7 retrospectives, not 1, not 2, 3, 4, 5, 7. So in the discussion that officers have had about this, have you taken into account the fact that cumulatively the total effect is that there has been a change worthy of a possible refusal?
Yeah, you're correct. When we're assessing this, we would be looking at the cumulative impact as well. Officers are of the view that the changes are acceptable in terms of they consider them to be non-material, but it is for members to decide as to whether or not, as part of your decision-making process, as members of the committee, whether or not you agree with that, and you may consider that the cumulative impact of all the changes, entirely correct, one may be fine, but you may think that all of the changes that are being proposed are such that it couldn't be dealt with as a non-material amendment. That's
Thank
your
you.
choice.
Thank you. And the final point, which is follow up to that point then, is has there been a time at which either us as an enforcement authority or the applicant who wasn't building according to the agreed plans, has anybody been alerted to the fact that there was one breach, or after a second or a third or a fourth or a fifth or a sixth or the 7th breach? In other words, how many has there got to be before enforcement either pick it up or somebody finds out, so we have this report before us? Because, I mean, it might just be a stroke of luck that there aren't 8, 9 or 10. It's just that we've caught them at the point when there's 7.
It has been investigated by an enforcement officer. As we said, in relation to the height, that has been checked and considered to be in accordance with the approved plans, excuse me. But in terms of when we went out, we're alerted to it, and if they continue to build out, we've just invited them to try and regularize it. They do so at their own risk. This is the point about planning enforcement. If someone's coming forward with a scheme and they're not building it out as per plan as being demonstrated in the photographs, they do so at their own risk, and it can result in us taking further action or in this case, inviting an application to regularise it. It's your decision to make as to whether or not you consider it as a non-material amendment.
Can you just clarify, Sim, that the objector said that he believes the height is 2 foot higher? Is it 2 foot higher or not? Has it been measured?
I've been led to believe, and I think the officer has spoken to the enforcement officer about that. They have been out on site, they have checked the height, and they consider that the height of the building is as per the approved plans from the planning inspector. So they're saying they've gone out and checked it on site.
Understood. Thank you.
Pat?
Thank you. This is not a question, really. I'm speaking as the local member. So obviously I won't be able to vote as a result of that. But I feel quite strongly about Nunnery Lane. Obviously, we can't. The elephant in the room, isn't it? It is the fact that this building is huge and over dominates the whole, road, because it's right next to the much smaller houses, not the big villas further up. If it were around the corner on Spechley Road, I think we might feel differently, but it's not around the corner on Spechley Road. The trouble is we can't do anything about that because the government inspector has already ruled. So what we have to consider, and all we can consider today, is the amendments here and whether we think they're material or non-material. I hate to agree with the officer on this because I don't like this building at all, but I do think they're non-material. I think that it's just going to get thrown back in our faces if we actually refuse this. I wish it were otherwise. I do think, clearly we have enforced, we've had a number of enforcement actions on this site. So it isn't that we've been idle about that particularly. It's more the fact that this application is the result of what the enforcement officers found and the need for it to come back to committee because there are alterations. Whether they're material or non-material is for the committee to decide. I do think they're non-material, sadly. I think we're going to lose an appeal if it happens on these. And that's really where we are. Sad state of affairs. I should mention that I'm acquainted with Mr. Ruff, but I have not discussed this application with him or with any of the objectors. So thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Councillor Hodges next.
Thank you. Like Pat, I feel that this development is totally out of place. We refused it as a committee. The inspector decided that it was appropriate and that it should be built. And we can't do anything about that. So we have this building there. I think we have to be very careful today to not let our judgment be marred by the fact that this is a retrospective application, because that always annoys us as a committee, that an applicant has gone ahead, done what they see fit, and then had to come back after the event to the committee. And it's not the right way round, and we know it's not the right way round, and that does make us feel, does give us a particular feeling about an application when that happens. So I think we have to be very careful to not be guided by the fact that it is a retrospective application, even though it annoys us. I've looked through all the changes that have been built that weren't according to the plans, and I've looked at all the comments that the officers have made about all of them. And sadly, as with Pat, sadly, I just feel that they aren't major changes, that they aren't material changes, and that we really have no alternative today but to approve them. And so, it's with a totally mixed feeling about this, but I do feel that we do have to approve these changes today.
Thank you, Joe. Councillor Barnes.
Thank you, Chair.
Yes, I get cross with retrospective applications, especially as it's only just been given permission and then they just build whatever they want. I think there is a problem with the windows on the top floor, not at the back particularly. I'm fairly relaxed about 5 becoming 6. However, those 2 large windows on the top floor will be overlooking properties across the road. And that wasn't at all what was proposed in the first instance. So for that reason, I think that there is a material change that we need to be worried about. And for that reason alone, actually, I would be very unhappy at approving this.
Sorry. Take your pick, who wants to go first?
Chair, thank you. I'm usually last, so it will make a change. Yeah, I think kind of echoing everyone's concerns, we don't like retrospective plans, but I do fear if we reject this, it will come back and it will drag out what has already been a long process, and the end result will unfortunately probably be the same. That's all. Thank you.
Marjorie?
Thank you. I think Councillor Barnes has raised an important point with regard to these windows. They are considerably much, the new windows are quite a lot higher than they were going to be before. I'm still concerned about this height business. I find it amazing that our officer can say, I don't know who's right, and I'm sure I have absolute faith in human nature to be accurate. And but a difference of 2 feet just seems amazing to me, that the officer can say it's this height, whereas the neighbours say it's 2 feet higher. I don't know if there's anything we can do about that, like recheck it. I'm also concerned that this is going to carry on. The building is still in the process of construction. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if the person doesn't decide to make a few more alterations. I don't know how to vote on this. I'm very much torn. Thank you.
I know that we've been told by the professional what is material and what isn't. I think in this case, my definition of material is, had the proper plans been submitted, might there have been a different outcome and approval from the inspector. And the problem is, I don't really know. I mean, Mr. Chambers, I think, referred to 600 mil or 2 feet, and there's quite a difference in 600 mil and 2 feet. But I don't know what it is. If it is that extent, then I would say that the objections that were put at the time that the original application was made would have had greater weight. In that case, it was material. On that basis, I understand it. If there's a refusal, then a fresh application has to be made. And those people who might have objected to the accurate plans get another chance. Or no, they get a first chance. So they didn't get, in the first case, they were shown plans that were inaccurate. So this height thing is critical. I mean, if it turned out to be, there's got to be a threshold. If it turned out to be 1 foot, I think you say, well, that could be in the build. But 2 feet, 600 mil, you're getting into a design thing. That's been designed to be beyond the threshold of what was approved. So that's what I'm sitting on that. I would like to know for certain what that difference is. May I ask, as a learning point for me, on another question, there's a reference in the papers to a protected tree, and it says the tree officer is going to be doing something. Now, I don't want to prejudice what the tree officer is going to do, but does that tree still exist? If it's gone, then I think that's a bit of an indicator that the developers don't give a toss about the height of the building, the trees or anything else. And that would have some sway on me, to be frank. Those two things, I'd like to be certain on the height difference, and I would like to know not all the ins and outs, whether the protected tree is still there or not.
Thank you for that. Perhaps something to ask Laura. Do you know whether?
I believe the tree is still there. It might be worth having a look at the photographs on the PowerPoint presentation, just have another look. I believe it's the front at the right. Yeah, it doesn't seem to pick it up from these photographs. That one there, yes.
Firstly, in relation to the height, that doesn't form part of this application because they're not applying to change the height. The height of the building, they're saying that they built it out as per the plan as agreed, as approved, and our enforcement officer has been out and they have advised that they consider that it has been built out as per plan. So they're saying the height is fine. So they're not actually applying so that's a point of clarification in terms of the consideration of the application. In terms of a point you made about you've received professional officer advice relating to material or non-material, the actual decision for whether or not you agree that it's a material change or a non-material change is actually for you to make that decision. We can guide with the officer's report, but ultimately it's for you to make that decision. Relating to the tree issue, it is a completely separate part of the process. It's subject to, it doesn't form part of this application, and it shouldn't really become involved in the consideration of this. What we're being asked to consider here is these are the changes that they've made, and you need to decide whether or not you consider them to be a material change or not. The fact that they may have done works to a tree is not really something that you should be considering as part of that process. You're assessing whether or not you are happy with the changes to the building.
Of course I wouldn't consider it, but I'd know about it, wouldn't I? If somebody had ripped a tree down, I'd form a judgment about the nature of the developers. I haven't done that. But I'm sorry to nail this, keep hitting the same nail, but what I've got now is that the residents, with all honesty and judgment, feel that the building has been built higher than was approved. The professional judgment and the developers is that it was built in accordance with plans. So we've got to sort of decide who's right.
The council officer, our enforcement officer, has measured it and he's advising that it has been built out as per plan.
I was going to say, I understand the concern that this may come back before us if we're minded to reject it. But if we pass it, surely we're sanctioning this kind of behavior in the future. And we'll have another case where somebody will make 3, 4, 5, 6 different amendments to their planning because they know they wouldn't have got it all through in one hit at the start. This makes me really uncomfortable. I'm not minded to support this.
Councillor Amos.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's just a really reinforcement from the planning officer because in light of comments that a couple of members have made, if we refuse this, it's not a minded to refuse and there's no appeal. So we can say no, end of. If then the applicants want to come back and do something and try and undo that, they then have to put in another application. So we have nothing to lose because we're not, I forget what the phrase was used, we're on a hiding to nothing or we're going to lose. We're not. It's a decision, it's not minded to. If they want to undo that decision, then it's up to the applicant to come back and actually put an application in and actually tell us what he does want, not what he can get away with these 7 different points.
before you answer, that sort of goes to the question I was going to ask. If we approve this, how do we then start further amendments going on over time? Whereas if we refuse it, you'd have to come back. This is what I've built. This is how I'm going to build it out. And we're trying to stabilize the position, I guess. It will get no worse, whereas potentially it could.
If members were minded to approve the application and consider that it would be a non-material amendment, there isn't anything stopping the applicant making further amendments. The process would be as if you were to say that you thought that it was material. So you're saying that it is a material change and therefore needs to be considered through a material as section 73 application as a minor material change. You could assess that. If you weren't happy with that and you said, well, we're going to refuse planning permission, that could be appealed against. If you were to approve the minor material change application, then again, the developer would have those plans being approved, but could still carry on and change at a future date and then seek to have to come back through the process to change it. The whole point about the process we're going through is we're seeking to regularize an existing breach, which is it hasn't been built out as per plan. The fact that we approve it or we don't approve it will not preclude that developer, if they want to, making further changes, but they again always do so at their own risk. And it may be that if they were to do other changes in terms of the build, that we may turn around and go, well, no, we don't consider that is acceptable and refuse it. And then they've got that risk of going to appeal and losing an appeal. All this is a process of regularization at this moment in time. This is the process we're going through. It's trying to regularize an existing breach of planning which has taken place because they haven't built it out as per plan. That's why we're here. We just whether or not we're happy that it's regularized or not. And if it's not, then it goes on to a different process.
Just a very quick comment, Mr. Chairman. I love Mr. Mann is regularized. I mean, what he actually means is allowing the applicant, allowing the developer to break the rules and get away with it. That's what he actually means. But regularize, I suppose, is the technical term.
One question, there is no, in the legislation, there's no mechanism about aggregated changes, because in some respects, what frustrates me is individual changes, yes, I could sort of understand, but at some point, the aggregation of all those changes moves you quite a way away from where we started.
Certainly, the whole point about the process today is whether or not you think the aggregate change, all the changes are sufficient to say that you don't consider it's a non-material amendment, and in which case you're saying, well, we think the changes are so significant that it is material to consideration, and then you would, with that view, you would then refuse this application, and then they would have to come and regularize through a planning application. If you were minded to then not agree those changes, then they would have the right to go to appeal against that. And the inspector may turn around and go, well, actually, this is what I approved. I don't agree with the changes that have been put in place, and refuse it, or dismiss the appeal, or he may actually, or she may consider that the changes are fine and actually basically allow the appeal. So it's a whole process that we've got to go through. And what we're saying from an officer's, to bring it back to where we are today, the officer's recommendation is that we consider that it's a non-material amendment, and we're happy, even with the aggregated change, that we're happy that it remains a non-material amendment. But it's for you to decide whether or not you consider that is the case or not.
Thank you. Any more questions? Councillor Amos Bill.
Thing to work. Well, I think once again, we've got a developer who has just gone ahead regardless of the plans agreed. And these are material, I consider these material alterations. They've gone ahead, they've done what they wanted. They've now come back to us to seek approval. I think it brings us into disrepute. And I think to maintain our integrity as a planning committee, that this should be refused. This is blatant disregard of the original planning application. So I think the material alterations should be not, we shouldn't approve them. I think we need to maintain our integrity as a committee and reject this application. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Just so I'm clear, regardless of what we approve or not approve today, does this stop the builder carrying on?
Having regard to the decision made by officers today, we would need to consider whether or not it would be expedient to take enforcement action. We have invited the application in. The decision today will be basically saying you think the changes are material and therefore have to go through that process. It's likely suggest that it would go through the process of them putting an application as a material change, and then that would come in front of the members, and then you would decide whether or not you considered that they were so material and so harmful that you would warrant a refusal, which could then go to the process of them appealing. So if you were to refuse it, they would then be able to appeal against that process.
My question, or what was behind the question was, let's assume we say, no, we believe these are material changes, so you need to resubmit. Can we put a stop on building works in the interim? So we don't then approve something or not approve it next time round, and meanwhile, what's actually out there has changed again.
What is being built is out there at the moment. We can't put a stop notice on them to stop them building because they may not build something that isn't as per plan. We can only put a stop notice where they are doing works which is contrary to the plan. So if moving forward, we wouldn't, because we couldn't stop them. They've already finished and completed the work, so we couldn't stop them doing it. They've done that. But there wouldn't be reasonable grounds for us to serve an enforcement notice to stop them on site because we didn't think that they were going to build out the rest of the development. It wouldn't be justified.
Councillor Amos.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to move that we refuse this on the grounds that the 7 cumulative changes, or breaches rather, are material.
I just, this being on webcam, I forget about this, but I just point out that my thing about 2 feet and 600 mil was ironic. I wasn't really saying there's a massive difference, but I understand that height is not an issue anyway.
Thank you. Councillor Amos has proposed a motion. Do we have any seconders? Councillor Bill Amos seconds the motion. Unless there are any other questions, shall we go to the vote?
All those in favour, please raise their hand. Favour of refusal on the grounds that the amendments are considered to be non-material. Material, apologise. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's 5, 4. Any against? 1, 2, 3, 4. And abstentions? 1 abstention. Therefore, that motion has been carried and the application is refused.
Thank you. Is that going to come back and vote? Yeah. Do the remaining officers want to come to the table at this point, or not? We will now return to item 7, Ketchfield. Who's got it? Sally got the poison check. This one yours? Okay, item 7. Over to you, Sally.
Thank you. We're discussing Ketchfield application. This item was brought to committee on the 29th of July, and it was deferred to negotiate amendments in the design to the apartment blocks, and in addition, a condition requested requiring further noise assessment. Bring it close. There's an officer report revising of these changes and can be read along with the original report in Appendix 1. There are 2 late papers on this item, one from Alan Tucker, the chairman of St. Peter the Great County Parish Council, and Roger Knight. The proposal is for 92 dwellings at the Ketchfield site on Broomhall Way. It includes an altered entrance off Taylor's Lane and includes green infrastructure. The presentation has been designed to advise of the changes and to include new information relating to the previous discussion, particularly in regard to views into the site in relationship with the surrounding area. Thank you. This site plan has the site outlined in red. Basic information such as the upgraded ring road with St. Peter's, the great residential area to the north, which abuts the ring road. Also the roundabout which links the Bath Road to access the city. Taylor's Lane is to the south, which would be the vehicular access to the site. Next slide, please. This is the aerial view of the site, and you can see the relationship to the river and the St. Peter's area. Next slide, please. This is an overview of the area of the South Worcestershire urban extension. As you can see, the pale green area to the south has been approved, but the section 106 is waiting to be signed. The pale yellow area adjacent to the site is approved, and the section 106 was signed in November 2019. Next slide, please. This is the view into the site from the A38. Next slide, please. This is the view into Taylor's Lane. Next slide, please. Looking across the site over Carrington Bridge. Next slide. And towards the large trees which is the south of the site. It's in the northeast direction and across the ring road towards St. Peter's and along the western boundary. Proposal is for 92 affordable units. It includes 10 bungalows, 48 two-storey dwellings. These are a mixture of 2 and 3 bedroom dwellings. There are 2 4-bedroom dwellings, which are in the southwest corner, and 42 flats in the units adjacent to the highway. The eastern area of the site is the green infrastructure area, which has a community focus. Here I'm showing you the 2 and the 3-bedroom dwellings. The ones in red are the 2-bedroom properties, and the ones in purple are the 3-bedroom properties. Next slide. And here's an example of the 3-bedroom design. Next slide, please. Outlined here, you can see the flat buildings, the flatted building, sorry, not flat building. You can see the 2-bedroom blocks are on the end and are circled on the plan. The ones in the centre area are the 1-bedroom units. Next slide, please. This is the elevational treatment of the flats. There's no cladding on these buildings, and the detailing you can see on the ground floor is brickwork detailing. You can also see the relationship with the Bund and the height of the mature landscaping and the height it will gain in relationship to the building, which, given that the trees are kind of climbing up the Bund, which tracks along the edge of the site. So that gives you a bit of a clearer idea in terms of the elevational treatments with the balconies, and you can see it a little more clearly. Next slide, please. These are the 4-bedroom dwellings. There are 2 in the site, sited in the southeast corner, as circled on the plan. Slide shows the 1 and 2-bedroom bungalows, which are set centrally in the scheme, and they kind of form the centre of the site and helps link it all together. And here's the design for those 1 and 2 bed bungalows. They're just examples, but just to give you an idea in terms of the design and the way that they would look and work. This is the view from across the roundabout towards the site. Next slide, please. And when positioned closer to Carrington Bridge, looking out over across the site. Next, we have some images and they help provide you, give some visual context of the proposal and how it relates to the surrounding area. This one is to demonstrate the landscaping by the Bund. So you can see that it softens off those visuals across the site, and these are towards the flatted units. And this is across the carriageway. The one on the left is the 2-bedroom unit, and the one to the right is the one of the 1-bedroom blocks. This slide is useful in showing how the landscaping will in time soften the visual impact of the proposal and how it's viewed from the highway. So the top slide is how it approximately will look when initially landscaped, and then the bottom slide shows it after about 5 years as the landscape matures. This is the view from across the A38 on the Kemsey side. This from within the site. This is an artist's image looking through the site and within the site. And then on the right, you can see the flatted buildings. So you get an understanding in terms of scale and massing and how it relates to the other units within the site. So you've got one of the 2-bedroom unit, one of the 2-story buildings on the left and the 3-story units on the right. So it gives you an understanding in terms of scale and that relationship and how it would relate to the highway. This slide is to clarify the position of the earth fund, which you've seen in earlier images, and also the use of swale ponds, which would act as balancing ponds, which are circled in red. There's a number of these within the site, which will provide visual interest, but also act as quite critical in terms of the drainage within the site. This is to give some further information and some clarity regarding the green infrastructure within the site for use as community areas, which also look to the adjacent site, which will in time open up to the wider urban extension. So you can see just to the south of the play area and to the north of where the allotments are, there's a footpath which would link into the adjacent site, which in time would link then to the footpath bridge, which goes over the carriageway over into the St. Peter's residential area. A condition has been added to the report, condition 35, for noise assessment. The agent has clarified that the noise survey was taken pre-lockdown on the 18th and 19th of March, and the report was completed in September 2020. Regarding the cladding as a building material, it's been removed from the apartment buildings, which are now brick only. It's been confirmed that it is proposed to have the cladding is proposed to be on 33 of the 2-story dwellings. So on this slide, you can see that those within the blue area are the 2-story dwelling houses that is proposed to be on. Proposed the material is a Siberian larch, which is a different material to the building referred to within the previous discussion that's on the Lowesmore building, and it would be treated to be pre-weathered, which would help resist some of the issues that we've had on that building in terms of the staining and its discoloration. So it would be more robust. But within discussions that I've had with the agent, if we want to look at that material a little further, then I think they're reasonably open to that. Lastly, the list of plans which form condition 2 will need to be updated and amended to reflect subsequently some of the plans have been updated, and so they would need to update those because they've been included within the presentation. But as such, I recommend approval with conditions as set out in section 3 of the report, with condition 2 updated and subject to the section 106 agreement. We can go back to the site plan just because I think it helps.
Thank you, Sally. Next, could I call my fellow councillors to the table? Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Chair. Well, once again, thank you for giving me the opportunity of speaking to you today regarding this application. I appreciate that this committee accepted certain points that were made at the last meeting and agreed to defer this application to re-examine both design and layout matters. I made much at the last meeting of the siting of the homes within the development, with particular reference to the apartment blocks, which, if accepted by this committee, will be adjacent to a roundabout on a major route giving access to the city. A considerable amount of discussion took place at that last meeting, with objections covering access and highway safety, the lack of public transport, pollution, noise levels, as well as house, apartment designs and sightings, all being so spoken of. I'll try not to repeat myself, but to offer new thoughts and considerations, albeit on the same theme. First, I'm grateful that the officers have taken on board the concerns that were raised regarding the issue of noise. While I'm aware that an earth bund will be built to mitigate this, I'm not convinced of how effective it will be. I'm sure the chair of this committee, my colleague in St. Peter's, will be aware that earth bunds may not achieve the noise alleviation that the modelling claims. I say this with reference to the number of complaints that we receive regarding noise down the Southern Link Road from local residents. I believe my colleague in Warndon Villages may have similar issues. It really does appear that the noise goes over the top. So in this instance, those living at the bund height level or above will, I'm sure, be affected. I appreciate that foliage is shown in the pictures on top of those earth bunds, but I would point out that similar foliage was planted on the bund on the northern side of the Southern Link Road. You will all, I believe, have seen the pictures provided of the different elevations of those apartments by the side of the road. If they are to a rough scale, then you will see that the bund only covers to the top of the ground floor in relation to the apartments. The noise is likely to resonate over the earth bund. Although I appreciate that it is documented that the work to complete the noise alleviation will have to be completed before the first resident moves in, I believe we can only expect yet more complaints, as these homes will be closer to the road than those who complain from the other side of the Southern Link Road now. But getting back to the site itself, like many others, I'm quite aware that there is a need for affordable housing to be built in the city. It would be wrong to deny people who need them homes that they believe will be better than where they presently reside. In this presentation, I'm trying to suggest that a different layout may be to the benefit of the buyers and renters, as well as the city itself. The original application, it is stated at paragraph 739, whilst the current scheme is for a greater number of houses, that's 92 as opposed to the original 81, and includes 7 apartment blocks. Equally, however, the previous application also included provision for 3-storey buildings, albeit in a different configuration on the site. That is to say, they were not by the main road. The objections that you have received are many, some opposed to the site itself and others believing the layout is not suitable. The Parish Council have written to you, which I understand you have received as a late paper. It is their opinion, and one which I alluded to when I first spoke on this subject, that the apartments could be better located within the development site. I described previously how I and others have considered the apartments to be featureless blocks, with another councillor suggesting that they were wretched, and if it is these that will be seen by visitors as a main gateway to our city. If they were away from the road, their subsequent residents would be less affected, and their impact on the immediate landscape would be considerably lessened. In reality, the application that has been returned for consideration has seen only a little change. The officer's recommendation for approval does go against considerable opposition, and while I'm aware that numbers of objectors may not have an impact on that decision, it does appear that there are substantial concerns. And that is not only for the home buyers and renters, but also on the impact on what I've already said is a heritage city. If I may refer you to that letter from St. Peter's Parish Council, I do believe that they have picked up on a most pertinent point, that of the city plan that has a cross-party endorsement. There is reference to the gateways to the city, and that tends to show just how much city leaders believe it worthwhile to maintain their appearance. While section 4 of that document, in describing a heritage city, suggests it should be attractive and welcoming to all, section 5 of the plan references sustaining and improving our assets. Of 2 bullet points within that section, one suggests enhancing further the main gateway routes into the city. The second is working with existing organisations like the city's 2 parish councils to increase involvement and participation in local areas. It is worth noting that the SWDP underpins the city plan. And this location at the Ketch roundabout is certainly such a point. Please consider how the apartment blocks will be viewed from all the angles, and then again, if they were to be located further to the southern edge of the development. The impact on this gateway would be considerably different. I really do think that the siting of the apartments at this development contradicts considerations given in that city plan. So to say much more would be repetitive, but I will take this opportunity of reminding Councillor Alcott that at the last meeting, she suggested that to object about the siting of such buildings at the entrance to a heritage city was in fact a lost cause. But she had a similar issue in her own ward and they were built anyway. So can I suggest that if you consider the development on that occasion, on that site, although just one member of the planning committee, you can make a difference in the way you vote on this occasion. But thank you very much indeed.
We got any questions for Steve? No? Thank you. Questions for the officer? Hello.
These are questions for the officers, are they? Yeah, thank you. Well, I have a few. The first one is the layout. And I'm just wondering why the bungalows are in the middle, sort of being overlooked, when if they're on the edge, they wouldn't be overlooked, and we might not be faced with the problem of these blocks on the edge, which obviously is causing a problem for local people. So why are the bungalows not on the edge rather than in the middle being overlooked? The second question is really to Ms. Hanshett. We're all concerned about getting people out of their cars and alternative forms of transport. What bus services will be serving this development? The third question is this word sustainable? The report says this is sustainable, and I'm never quite sure what anybody means by this, but my simple understanding is that the world's resources are finite. So if you use them up, there ain't no more. Now, if you're built using bricks and glass and metal and everything else, those resources have gone for good. So I'm not quite sure how this development, this constant development, is sustainable, because it clearly isn't, because we're just using up the world's resources that cannot be replaced. The fourth question is, obviously in recommending this, the officers are saying in fact that there is capacity at our hospitals for what, 92 dwellings, let's say 400 people thereabouts, rough figure. So clearly the officers are saying that there is capacity at our hospitals. There are places available and appointments to be got at our doctor's surgeries. There are spare places in the primary schools. Now, obviously I'm out of touch, but can the officer just confirm where this capacity at hospital, in the surgeries and in the schools are? Because I don't know where they are. And the final point is just really an observation, I suppose. I think these blocks are ugly. Now, that is obviously a personal subjective view, but we are charged with using our judgment. And I think it's a shame that I don't see why social housing should necessarily be ugly. I think there's a lack of imagination in the design here. I really think they could have been made to look a lot nicer, whether they're located in the middle or the centre or on the edges, it doesn't matter. I think the architects could have done a much better job.
In regards to the bungalows, Personally, I think that it's quite nice that they're centrally located. I think it can really help to invite a sense of community. I think you're also likely to have much greater sense of natural surveillance. We've done it in other schemes in Worcester where we've tried to locate bungalows and clusters, because then you can really invoke a sense of community, you know, it can really help invoke that. So I think personally it's quite nice that they're clustered together, and by having them quite centrally located, you can then get the links to the footpaths and some of the wider web, some of the links through to the site. Personally, I think that I don't mind that within the scheme. I think that's quite a positive design choice. Possibly the flats, I can understand why having them possibly on the edge, that it can feel that they skirt around the site. But I think when you see some of the street layouts, I think it works quite positively in helping to provide a sense of community, and having that mix of accommodation, it works quite well. You're taking the question?
I think importantly, there have been a number of comments about alternative positions of buildings, units within the site. The application before the committee is the one to be determined. So it is for you to make a decision whether or not you are happy with what's in front of you or unhappy. And it's your decision to make, to take everything into consideration and say, I've looked at this, I'm not happy with the layout, and I therefore would recommend a refusal. We're not in a position where we would be moving bits around on the site. It is, we are determining what's in front of us. In terms of sustainability, I'm given to understand that the orientation of the to address the concerns of Councillor Amos, all development coming forward will use resources. It's how we marshal those resources. Use of brick is a natural resource which is dug out of the ground, and glass is infinitely renewable and reusable. So they are trying to use materials which are more natural. The buildings have been orientated in such way, the blocks of flats, as I understand it, have been orientated in a way to gain the maximum passive solar gain. So it actually reduces down the cost of heating them, because they're obviously being heated during the day by the sunlight. Just make sure I just go down your list. In terms of the capacity, as part of this process, we'd obviously do look at, we can consult with the various bodies and agencies in relation to that, and they do come forward with what they consider needs to be included within an application, including seeking contributions towards the different infrastructure, and that process has been gone through. Obviously, we are in a position here where we're looking to bring forward affordable units, and therefore there is a wider public benefit associated with the development itself, because it is addressing and assisting in reducing housing need. In terms of the comment regarding whether or not the buildings are ugly or not, that's precisely why you're here, Councillor Amos. It's your decision to make as to whether or not, as a planning balance, you consider that the proposed development yourself and collectively, when you finally make the decision, as to whether or not you consider that the appearance of the building is unacceptable or not, whether the layout's unacceptable or not, and whether or not, taking all that into consideration, the benefits of the scheme for affordable housing are outweighed by what you perceive or consider to be harm. So it's a pure case of planning and balance, effectively, in respect of how you achieve the final decision on this, whether or not you consider they're ugly or so ugly that it outweighs the benefit. That's just on that point. And finally, in terms of the point 2, which is the bus service, I will hand over to my colleague from County on that.
Thank you. Yes, Councillor Amos, with regard to bus services, we do accept the level of reduction in services in this particular area. It does cause a concern.
for local residents. However, the County Council have proposals to create an enhanced bus service for the 32 and the 33 linked to the South Worcester Urban Extension, obviously the wider site to this. We've already secured significant contributions, not only from the South Worcester Urban Extension, but from various housing developments that have gone ahead in Kemsey recently, and that money has been secured towards improving those services.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm grateful for those answers. Pity Ms. Hanchett wasn't at the meeting, County Council meeting this morning, where I announced about the enhanced partnership. So just absolutely on message there. So thank you very much for that one. If I just come back briefly to Mr. Manley, I admire him actually because he didn't answer the question that was fundamental to this. So I admire him. But the question was about the infrastructure, and it's a very serious point in terms of where we are with hospital and GP provision and primary school provision, and secondary as well. Actually, we're going to build a new secondary school in Worcester. Of course, if it's not near there, I mean, it's going to be a problem. But I mean, if we've consulted with these people, what have they actually told us? Because the last time we had something reported, I forget which application it was, the hospital was almost begging us, please, look, we can't take any more. And then on another application, they asked for some money. And although I raised the issue and made a fuss about it, we were told, well, they're not allowed to ask for money. We can't give them any money. So if we're now saying the hospital can get Section 106 money, brilliant. But it still begs the fundamental question of the capacity now. We're talking, what, 400 people, I suspect, a very high proportion of which will be children. So, you know, where is the capacity in the system? And have these providers said, yes, we can cope with more people? Because if they have, that's great. But my understanding is that they said just the opposite. First question was why Mr. Manning didn't answer it, but second question is if he could answer it.
Yeah, I will answer. As part of the application, there was a viability assessment undertaken to bring forward to assess whether or not it's capacity within the scheme to provide everything that's being sought by the consultant, by the different consultees as part of that process. They come forward and they put forward the need to us. And as part of that viability assessment, as I understand it, we have to look at that as a balancing act between whether or not we wish the 92 units, or in fact, actually whether or not we can meet all the Section 106 requirements. Obviously, in this instance, the viability is suggesting, as I understand it, that there is a limited amount that can be contributed to the infrastructure within the area. Now, this is obviously always a planning balance, because it's a balance between trying to deliver affordable housing, or as an offset to, you know, making accommodation for people who don't have their own units to stay in, so the homeless, and addressing some of our homelessness issues, as opposed to providing for the infrastructure. And it is always going to be a planning balance in that respect, and that's why we undertake the viability assessment. And the viability assessment is saying that there is only a limited capacity in terms of what can be given. Effectively, what you're doing is you're taking the affordable housing scheme being provided by an affordable housing provider, and they are trying to bring forward schemes, and there's only a limited amount of funding available to actually bring the scheme forward. Ultimately, that may mean reduced contributions towards infrastructure outside of the site, but it is that offset, is that balance, and that's why we do the viability assessment.
Thank you. Before I come to you, Joe, can I just ask, I had a conversation with Karen at our last discussion about this. There was talk about potential alternative access for pedestrians, given the nature of the isolation of the site. It's not a highways issue, but I just wonder whether, I'm assuming that this site, if approved, will come up much sooner than the rest of the Welbeck development, which is a massive build out, which is going to take some time. Can we condition the that there is no occupation of this site if the scheme is approved until the works on the pedestrian crossing on the A38 are complete and commissioned.
If that's a question to me, if you mean the pedestrian crossing improvements that are part of this development, then yes, but if you are referring to the signal controlled pedestrian crossing that is linked to the South Worcester Urban Extension site, then I would have to take advice from your officers on that.
Yeah, it's the latter. How are you going to cross the A38 if this was built out and there's no way through Welbeck to get to the pedestrian bridge?
Right, sorry, Sim, is it okay if I do come back on that? I mean, it is unfortunate that this strategic allocation is coming forward in sort of 3 separate parcels. And obviously the bulk of the infrastructure, with the exception of the bridge that we have forward funded ourselves as a county council, the bulk of the infrastructure and the improvements will come forward with the Welbeck site, which at the moment is the one that's the furthest behind because it still hasn't technically got its consent. So yes, once that site is built out and those improvements, the pedestrian and cycle access from this site will be great. It will be direct. But what we have accepted is we've worked very closely with the developer they've put forward proposals for some enhanced pedestrian facilities and connections to the A38 and an uncontrolled crossing point of the A38 to link pedestrians to the bus stops. And in the short term, we have deemed that those are acceptable in the short term until the wider, much more direct and desirable infrastructure does come forward. But we have said what they are proposing is acceptable.
Just for clarity, the other 2 parts of the Welbeck are actually in Malvern Hills, so we have no control over those developments in effect.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I think the issue, the question was raised was regarding the conditional control or delivery of the footpath link. The problem with a planning condition is that you can't impose a condition upon a developer to try and meet it if the land falls outside the control. So trying, as I understand it, the footpath link to the footbridge would need to go across third-party land, and therefore you wouldn't be able to condition that. I think the thing about this site is that it is ahead of the game, really. It's coming ahead of everything else, and therefore I think there's always going to be a situation where a big housing development or a wider redevelopment of an area, it's always going to be the first phase will be brought forward, and that will obviously have some of these issues, and it's going to be waiting for the other infrastructure to sort of catch up in respect of the other phases. I think that's where it's fair to say where we are, but I don't think we'd be able to impose a condition to require that footpath link across the third-party land because we couldn't control it.
Could we then, and I assume Taylor's Lane at some point is going to be stopped up. If Taylor's Lane was stopped up just above this development, you could provide pedestrian access along the Taylor's Lane, because currently that's where the closest connection to the footbridge is. Is that a possibility?
Sorry, I don't know if it's... yes, when the wider Welbeck site comes forward, that is absolutely what is going to happen. The whole area will change, and the Taylor's Lane will become a walking and cycling route, and you will be able to leave this site to have a direct link then to the new footbridge that's already been in place. As we said, it's unfortunate that this is coming forward in advance of those proposals.
But I'm assuming that, let's assume this gets approved and gets built out. At some point, and I would assume pre-occupation, Taylor's Lane, as far as the entrance to this site goes, will have to be blocked up. Otherwise, we'll have construction traffic going up and down Taylor's Lane its entirety.
No, Taylor's Lane is not stopped up at almost at the commencement of development
the Whalebeck site. It gets stopped at some point during its occupation, and apologies, I do not know what point that is. Taylor's Lane will be used as a construction access for not only this site, but also for the St Modwyn site. That they are currently on site building their employment land at the moment. They will also be using Taylor's Lane as a construction access for the St Modwyn Homes development when they bring that forward. I believe they've got, if they haven't got reserve matters, they're very soon be getting reserve matters, and they will be commencing on site with that. So Taylor's Lane will be for, you know, a couple of years, potentially it will be a construction route. We have agreed with St Modwyn that Taylor's Lane is not suitable for two-way construction traffic. So they were, and we've also agreed with these developers, so that there will be a traffic regulation order put in place to make Taylor's Lane one way in order to have safe construction use of the site, of the road. I'm pretty certain it's eastbound. So that is from the A38 towards Norton Road. Yes, I'm fairly certain.
Councillor Hodges.
Gosh, I've almost forgotten what I was going to say. It was so technical. Okay, in common with Councillor Alan Amos, I was not here on the 29th of July to hear the original debate on this. So I'm relying on the minutes, which have been approved, so I take it that they're accurate, on what was said. And it does appear to me from these minutes that members agreed that most concerns had been addressed, apart from the design and appearance of the apartment blocks. So that seems to me what we are actually here for, to look at how the apartment blocks may have been changed, whether that's sufficient improvement to now approve this application, which is much, much needed. 92 families and children, parents, grandparents are waiting for an affordable home. And here we have within our grasp the means to give those 92 families a home. So to me, that is a most important overriding factor in whether we approve this or not. Could I ask the officer, could he clearly, or she clearly explain to me what has changed about the apartment blocks that wasn't happy, people weren't happy with originally, and what we're now faced with, and is that sufficient change? Thank you.
The report, sorry, it's set out in the report on 2.2 that the amendments to the apartment blocks, they've introduced setback brickwork panels located below smaller window openings, southern elevations. So they've changed it so there's a bit more texture and a bit more visual interest within them, so they're not quite as blank. They've also reduced the height of the chimney features. They were quite stark features within the elevations, so those have been reduced down. And they've also put in some projecting brickwork, which courses around the ground level for visual interest. So it's kind of a banding, and it just softens those elevations. It makes it look a bit less stark within the brickwork. So you will get some texture and visual interest within those bricks. So they will be brick. There's not, we quite often see within some of the designs that we see coming forward, a range of materials. This is very much a brick is the dominant kind of material and characteristic within the site, but it has been softened down quite significantly, which you don't really appreciate from some of the plans and visuals that we can provide, because it doesn't, it's quite difficult to get that kind of texture. But yeah, that's what's been changed.
Okay, so now we're faced with the question, really, it's a personal opinion of each of us. Do we think that the design now is sufficiently acceptable to approve these? I mean, that seems to me, from the minutes, to be the crux of what we're here to decide. So, right. Okay, so the top one was the original and the bottom one is that right? No. Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, I think one of the other issues that was coming out from one of the other points that was raised by members before was because there was reference to the gateway, it being in a gateway location. It's often very difficult when you've just got the plans in front of you to actually visualize that from what it would be like coming up to a junction in the vehicle. And so as part of this presentation and as a direct result of the last meeting, the developer has actually gone away and come in with some photo montages to give an illustration of this is what you will see. Those plans have been, those photo montages were shown to you as part of that. So it's a combination of the changes to the elevation to try and break them up a little bit, plus also additional information to show them what they would look like at a distance from various vantage points to assist members in making that their final decision.
If I could just finish by saying, as a member who represents a ward where at least half the properties are apartment blocks, and it's a necessity in our present day that people do live in apartment blocks. In fact, some people like to live in apartment blocks. And there are some very posh apartment blocks around, I can tell you. But I can't quite see what the objection is to apartment blocks and how this is going to mar the entry to the city. You know, I can't quite gather what the great objection is to having apartment blocks on the edge of a development. To me, this seems perfectly acceptable. I think it's absolutely great that we're going to get 92 affordable units in our city, and I shall certainly be voting for it.
Just as a comment, one of the questions I was going to ask but is answered by the presentation is what's it going to look like? And importantly, they've said in 5 years' time, this is what it looks like. And to be honest, any new build is going to stick out like a sore thumb on day one. But 5 years on, to me, if you're going down a dual carriageway, even if you stick to the speed limit of 60 miles an hour, to me, that looks wholly acceptable.
Thank you, Chair. To some extent, you've anticipated one of my comments there. Yeah, the planning balance is an interesting one here. I'm just going to confine myself to the design issues because that really was what came out of the last meeting. We've dealt with everything else, I think. I think there's been a lot of, well, there's been a certain amount of enhancement of these blocks, which does break up the facade. They look a bit less prison-like or a bit less sort of council estate-like, if you want to call it that. And that's all to the good. I do think, and I will say this for the future rather than just for now, is that it's a real pity that in other parts of the country, there are council or well, what would normally be called council houses, but now are social housing developments that have been up for the Sterling Prize. Why aren't we? Why isn't this developer being that ambitious? They really aren't being very ambitious. And that's a great pity. I hope they will be in future. I hope other developers will be in future. That said, I don't think the difference between, I don't think that's a good enough reason at the moment to refuse this. It's a pity because I do think that they could have done much better. I do think that the fact that you can just see the top floor of some of the flats above the tree line isn't really a huge issue. As you say, you're passing them at speed on that road. It's not going to be something you're going to look at because you're looking at the road, I hope. You know, the traffic around you. The people of St. Peter's, I think it's so far away, and the ground level on the development side of the road is much lower. So actually, you are just seeing a little bit of the top floor. It's not a huge amount even of that. So the planning balance is that, as Councillor Hodges has said, 92 affordable houses, dwellings is a big factor. And I think for me, that's a decider.
Thank you, Pat. Councillor Roberts.
Thank you, Chair. I was at the last meeting, and I think Steve McKay, local councillor, and the parish councillor's letter encapsulate the concerns. Firstly, this thing about being a gateway. We've only got so many, haven't we? And for the next 100 years, When you come to Worcester, that's what you're going to see, and that's going to be your first impression of Worcester, and impressions do count. So I think that they're right to be concerned about that. We should get the best we possibly can on this site, and that leads on to the 3-story blocks. Now, the Parish Council refers to them as 1950s barracks and blocks on the landscape. They're not things of beauty. I get this business about 95 people desperate to live, but in a way, it isn't so much the things of beauty for other people I'm bothered about. It's a bit rather what Pat said. It's this low expectations, and you think of the outcomes for perhaps a young family in places which are basically bog standard, and I don't think they have great expectations. And just like Pat says, elsewhere in the country, and I can produce drawings, you've got social housing developers who are much more imaginative. And I think we're not absolutely products of the environment in which we are brought up in, but it does help. It does help. And these 3-story blocks, I do worry about. I might say, without these 3-story blocks, I'd be a very enthusiastic supporter of this application. But it's now marginal. It's good that there's been a slight improvement, but that's a double-edged sword. If there's a slight improvement now, why wasn't it done in the first place? You know, who was actually bothered? It's just pile them up and fill them up and on to the next site, it seems to be, rather than let's provide proper housing for real people. There we are. On the other point that was raised last time was about noise. Now, I know how confusing this gets, but if you look through the papers, it talks in 2.5, it talks about a bund and a barrier, acoustic barrier. And then under the conditions 35, I think it talks about acceptable for residential occupation. And it also refers in the papers that if it's not reasonable or it's not satisfactory, mitigation or mitigating measures will have to be taken. I don't quite understand. Does that mean, if it were approved, that you wouldn't allow occupation, not allow occupation till the bund is built, as the papers say, but until the bund is built and any mitigating measures were taken? Because there is a subtle difference. You get a bund and it isn't effective, so what? And I might say that I look at the alarm with other houses along the 8440, not necessarily in our city area, where I think noise might be a factor. But there we are. So I'm concerned. I'm concerned with that noise thing. I'd like to get that clarified, that it would mean the bond plus any mitigation. Sort of helpful to know what would be acceptable, bearing in mind what other people accepted elsewhere. And you know, I'm really torn about the 3-story block. It's not a thing of beauty. It's not as ugly as it was. But is it something, if I was starting over again, perhaps a single parent at one side of with a child, you know, is it something from which I could aspire to advance? I don't know. Thank you, Chair.
I will surmise, because I can only do that, this is the second applicant for this site. There was a previous application approved with a previous, another housing association, which I think had less numbers on it. And I suspect, I suspect it's about making the site viable, which is why we've got 3 zones. Sorry?
In regards to the condition about the noise, the condition is worded so that a noise assessment would be undertaken and all of the mitigation measures that are necessary are fully implemented before the units could be occupied. So if it needed additional glazing or certain specification of glazing, that those measures need to be implemented on site before the units could be occupied.
My question is twofold. I agree with Councillor Amos. There's no beating around the bush. These are ugly. Whether anybody wants to admit it or not, then they're not attractive buildings. I don't really understand why they need to be 3 stories myself. I think if they were 2 stories, there probably wouldn't be any argument from the people across the road, and they'd be hidden by the trees. I don't understand why these blocks have to be 3 stories. The second point, or rather a question, is regarding the planting on the Bund line. And we saw in the presentation that over the course of 5 years, the level of the trees. When is the planting going to start? Because if that planting starts when the development is finished, it's 5 years from the start of the development. And I don't imagine that anybody needs access on this Bund line. So it would make sense to me for that planting to start right at the start of the development. And then if the development takes 12 months, you're 1 year ahead of the game. And in which case the picture I saw takes 4 years, not 5. And I wonder if that's something that can be considered, because that makes sense to me to knock a year off that plan. Thank you.
I can just respond to that. I believe we should be able to condition it, because when the A440 was widened, I think the Bund on the St. Peter's, existing St. Peter's side, was the first thing to be put in place. And then the planting followed that whilst the road was being constructed. So you're right, it gives us at least a year, if not more. So if we could condition that, Sally, that would be good. What's you thinking about that one? Oh dear.
Thanks, Chair. Well, it's not as bad as it was, but it isn't delightful, is it? I still worry about wood cladding because it's been such a disaster elsewhere. And I worry that it's affordable housing, but there's no transport, and that people could end up being abandoned on the edge of town with very few facilities. The other issue, going back to the design of the buildings, the 3-story ones, they've got chimneys. What do they need chimneys for? Is there going to be gas into the buildings when we know gas is being phased out? Are there going to be heat pumps? I'd like to understand more about why there are chimneys, what their function is, and really to have a better idea of the heating overall.
Sally, will we be able to answer any of those?
Sorry, I don't know the answer. I can try and find it out for you. I suspect that the chimney design is a feature, a building feature, rather than for practical purpose. I can get that clarified for you if you want. Pardon? Maybe. Just trying to find it within the information within the application for you. Once I know, I'll
Would committee members be happy if I called the applicant to the table? Strictly speaking, we shouldn't, but there you go. If you can limit your responses to the specific questions asked, thanks.
So I'll deal with the chimneys first. The chimneys are a decorative feature just to add visual interest. The apartments won't be served by gas. They're going to be served by ground sourced heat pumps. It's big part of the whole development is the kind of sustainability angle. So it's all of a sort of a low carbon, high SAP rating. So all properties will be SAP A rated, and the ground source heat pumps are obviously a low carbon form of energy generation. So that's why they're there in those units.
Marjorie.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. going back to, well, I wanted to talk about two things. One is what we're about at the moment. In the minutes of the meeting on the 29th, there are two different statements. One is that it says most concerns have been addressed apart from the design and appearance of the apartment blocks, but just below that, proposal to defer the application in order for negotiations to take place on design and layout. And I do remember a lot of discussion about the layout of the various different types of buildings on this site. So I did think that that was going to be reviewed, but of course it hasn't been. All we've got are these quite minor changes to the appearance of the apartment blocks. And I must say, I think it's absolutely nonsensical to put chimneys on buildings as a design feature. If they've got ground source heat pumps, we should be, celebrating that by not having chimneys. And then I also wanted to speak about this business of the main gateway routes into our city. I don't know, is the city plan actually a material consideration? And if it is, then I think that what the city plan says about the gateway routes into the city being enhanced goes directly against this application. I don't think that route into that gateway into the city will be enhanced. So I'm opposed to this application.
Joe.
Oh, breaks my heart. 92 homes here. We're turning down 92 affordable homes. What is it that we've got against apartment blocks? I was trying to think about Diglis, and we've got a lot of apartment blocks along Diglis. Here is an entrance into the city along the river, and we're more than happy to have apartment blocks there. And I've got friends who live in those apartment blocks, and let me tell you, they are very expensive, a lot more expensive than if you went and bought a house. So we're not saying that apartment blocks are second best or anything like that. They are important additions to the type of housing that people can live in. And we've got the opportunity here to have homes for 92 families. And we're debating turning this down because we don't like apartment blocks and we don't think these apartment blocks look very nice. We can see what it will look like when the Bund is in place and the vegetation has grown. You'll hardly see them if you don't like them. And I just think we are missing out. We are possibly going to turn down this wonderful opportunity to house our homeless people in this city. And it just amazes me. It amazes me when we're going to turn it down because we've got a chimney on a building or because we've got a site of an apartment block as we drive into the city. When, as Pat pointed out, you won't actually be looking at the houses on either side because you'll be driving along a very fast dual carriageway and you will have your eyes on the road. I'm just amazed.
Marjorie?
I'd just like to come back on that. I have no objection whatsoever to apartment blocks. I just think they should be somewhere else on the site.
Anybody else with any questions? Owen.
I don't know if it's better directed to the applicant if he's allowed to answer. I was just wondering that the third story of these blocks, if there was no third story and these were two-story blocks, what would the capacity of the site be? Rather than 92 homes, what would it be if there wasn't a third story on these blocks?
I fear the answer will be, we can only deal with what's in front of us. And the application is for 92 with us.
Just to add to Councillor Hodges' comments there, let's just remember there are 4,000 families on our housing waiting list who need those homes very badly. And I would urge you to consider that carefully before you make a decision.
Chair, thank you. Sorry, just with reference to obviously the gateways into the city, if you access the city via the Whittington Road and then the London Road, you will drive past many three-storey buildings that have just been built, unfortunately. Thank you.
Councillor Amos, do you wish to say?
Well, yes, it's really directed to the office for their advice. You know, there's been discussion about blocks of flats for social housing. And Councillor Cleary and I will both know, having represented Bund, that there are whole streets of blocks of flats, and they're virtually all full of families, often single mothers with children. And in the ground level where you go in are lots of pushchairs and prams. And they're left there because people find it very difficult to get them up the stairs. I don't actually think at all, for anybody, whether social housing or not, bringing children up, this will be a high percentage of children, flats are the most conducive means of accommodation to bring up children, frankly. Houses and gardens is what we need. So I am interested to know why a social housing provider has gone so heavily for apartments when that is clearly going out of fashion. As it is, I mean, these will, you know, we're not going to have these things indefinitely, I don't think. But the land is there. So what discussions have we had with them in the design stage and the planning stage to say, look, you know, should everybody be in flats rather than houses with gardens? Because that is the community. These kids have got to grow up somewhere, and dragging them up and down, you know, from outside into flats is not conducive to them, frankly. Their lifestyle, they're entitled to as good a lifestyle as anybody else. It seems that, well, if it's social housing, bung them in flats, that's okay. If people choose that, that's absolutely fine. But I remember parents coming to me about housing issues. Every single one wanted to get out of the flats, anywhere but out of a flat. They didn't want to go into a flat, they wanted a house. You know, so why are we still building these blocks? You know, regardless of whether they're ugly or not, let's put that to one side. This is what we're doing. We're going to put 92 families in flats.
Councillor Cleary.
Nobody's answered my question, whether it's the planning officer or the applicant. Can somebody tell me what's the difference in capacity if there wasn't a third storey on the blocks, please?
If you reduced, currently, there are proposed to be 42 units on the flat units on the site. 30 of those are one-bedroom units and 12 of them are two-bedroom units. So if you reduce the capacity by 1/3, you would lose 14 units, and it would be reduced to 28. So you'd have 20 one-bed units and 8 two-bed units.
Just to clarify, that's 14 units from the whole site.
Yeah.
So it would be
flats.
78.
Yeah, sorry, just to make a comment, obviously in an ideal world, and you know, if everybody wanted to sort of put their hands in their pockets, we could, you know, move away from apartment blocks, but with current funding locally and nationally, I do not see an alternative to them. Thank you.
Any more questions? Otherwise, I'll be looking for a motion to approve or not.
Propose.
So, excuse me. So we have a motion to approve the application before us.
Can I just confirm, Chair, that that will be subject to the amendment to condition 2 to refer to the latest plans, and a amendment to condition 11 regarding timescales for the planting of the Bund? Thank you. All those in favour, please. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5. All those against? 1. And abstentions, please. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The motion is therefore carried and the application's approved, minded to approve. Thank you.
My God, how many versions? That was hard work, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to get a coffee before we move on? Yeah. So we have 5 minutes. Agenda item 8, land adjacent to 97 Foley Road. Sally.
Thank you. Can I have a presentation, please? My notes. My notes. Sorry. The application is at 97 Foley Road. It's an application that has been before you already. The application came to you last year for an amendment to the scheme in relation to a rear extension and some changes to the side elevation of windows, and it was approved last year. At that time, the application, it continued the original time frame of the original host application, and so it has now expired. So this is an application for the same scheme presented to you today. Next slide, please. Here's the site, so you can see the original house, which is outlined in blue, and the application site is in red. The existing garage you can see there on the picture, and the site has been subdivided. So it no longer functions as a single site. It's now been subdivided and it operates as two. Next slide, please. Here you can see further into the site, and the side elevation, it adjoins the rear gardens of the adjoining properties. This is the view, and in the background you can see the buildings to the south of Christopher Whitehead. Slide, please. This is the proposed two-story dwelling, but there's accommodation in the roof area. The plans are, as previously approved, that I've confirmed with the agent that there have been no alterations to the approved scheme. There's on the ground floor, there's a living room and kitchen diner and bathroom. On the first floor, there's bathroom and bedrooms, and then the third bedroom up in the roof area with ensuite. Next slide, please. And here are the elevational plans. Within the report, it's proposed that the condition which relates to the side-facing windows, that they continue to be obscurely glazed. And in the previous scheme, there were issues in terms of concerns about outlook within the roof area, and this is to remain the same, with the roof light continue to be in the same area from the ensuite. The recommendation is for approval with the conditions which are included within the report. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that the issue here is a very important one, and it's a principle, really, of whether we build in gardens. My understanding is that planning policy guidance is that we don't build in gardens unless there are exceptional reasons. I can't see any exceptional reasons here. The house, whether it's nice or not, is of no consequence, really. It may be a very nice house in its own right. Although I note that this is being 3 stories, it is very high in that area. But nonetheless, it's really a question, it seems to me, of location, location, location. And I think this committee has got to decide whether a garden is the right place for a 3-story house. This particular location is very tight in terms of density, very tight in terms of parking. So it's not an obvious place to insert another large house. And it wasn't that long ago that some of us were out knocking on doors, talking to people. I think every single party said, we've got to protect green space. We've got to look after our open spaces, our green areas and so on. Unanimously, they said that. Well, I'm going to be consistent today and vote for what I said, which is that we want to preserve open spaces, and if we can't protect the garden, I'm not sure what we can protect or what we've got the will to protect. So this, Mr. Chairman, is really what it's about.
Councillor Hodges.
Thank you. Well, I was going to ask, why is this here before us today? As I read the papers, it seems that permission has already been granted on this site for a building similar or the same as the one that we're considering today. And that is in material planning consideration is significant. So it is significant, the fact that we've already given planning permission. There are no neighbouring objections. There are no objections to this. So why are we actually debating it when our officers think that it's suitable? Planning permission has already been given and nobody's objecting to it. So it does seem to me, for a committee that that spend a lot of time debating planning applications, that this is somewhat of a waste of time.
No questions, and I'm of the same opinion as Councillor Hodges. Why is it here? We've decided on this once already. I think we need to be consistent and just get it through.
Well, Mr. Chairman, the answer to that, because obviously an indirect question, and a few things are certain in this world. The only certain thing about this committee is that Councillor Hodges will come in after what I've said and say the direct opposite. Always happens. But if she looked at paragraph 1.2, she'll see why it's before this committee. I'm exercising my democratic right and duty to call in any application anywhere in the city that I want to call in with good reasons. There's a principle involved here. As for objections, she may not have been at that committee meeting, but there was an objection to the last application. And the gentleman whose garden was overlooked by this, he'd been there, I forget whether he's been there 30 or 40 years. The garden meant a lot to him, his outlook meant a lot to him. And when the committee voted to approve this, he was in tears because it meant so much to him. My understanding is, could be wrong, but my understanding is he hasn't bothered this time because it's not worth it. So that says something about the committee, doesn't it? It's not even worth bothering to come. So that objection, as far as I understand, is stand just because somebody doesn't come, doesn't mean there are objections. So I will continue, actually, Councillor Hodges, to exercise my democratic right to call in any application. And if you want to know the reason, just look at the beginning of the report, 1.2. It says it all there. I think even you can understand that because it's only one sentence.
Can I reply, as I've been named 3 or 4 times in that, and object very strongly, and I'd like it minuted, to the personal nature of Councillor Amos's comments that he's just made. Councillor Agar next to my side said exactly the same thing, but he hasn't actually mentioned her. And when he says that something is only one sentence, so I should be able to understand that, I think that's a very personal insult. I do take exception to it. I object to it very strongly, and I'd like it minuted that I object to it very strongly. What Councillor Amos thinks I can understand and can't is of absolutely no consequence or interest to me. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I only have one question. Marjorie first.
I'd just like to draw attention to the fact that there doesn't really seem to be a garden on this land. All I can see is a garage, an existing garage. Admittedly, I've only got one photograph to look at, but I don't think it would be such a big deal if a house was built on that land, and I'd be in favour of this application. Page 87. But that only shows us what it's going to look like. It doesn't show us what it's like at the moment. I mean, Councillor Amos is saying that it's building on a garden, but is it a garden? Well, it just shows that there's an area of land. It doesn't show that it's a garden in any sense that I understand that. Maybe it's a minor point, but anyway, I think it's fine.
My question was going to be, I remember a long debate about backland development. This doesn't qualify as backland.
It has active frontage, so it doesn't have the same. Backland is that it's kind of hidden behind. That's the nature of backland. Because this has an active frontage, it's considered the infill development, which is different.
Divide along the face of the street, but you can't divide off the back.
Yeah, so if it's kind of shoehorned behind the back where you can only access it kind of down the side and it's at the back and it has no active frontage, and it's considered backland, whereas this would be considered infill because it's continuing that.
No? Anybody want to propose a motion?
In favour.
Over to you.
Thank you. The motion is to approve in accordance with the officer's recommendation. All those in favour? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Those against? 1, 2. Any abstentions? 1. Motion's carried. Thank you, Chair.
Agenda item 10. Decisions contrary to officer recommendation.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to introduce the item and then Mr. Manley will take you through the options set out in the report. So this item is here before you today, members, because the chair of committee and some members have requested that the committee look again at the process that we're currently operating, which we refer to as minded to refuse. And the paper before you is an options paper, and it's for this committee to discuss and consider the options and make a recommendation for the way forward should you wish to choose to change the current procedure. And you will be making a recommendation to council if any changes are required to the current constitution. So options discussion recommendation today is what we're doing. And really, as I've outlined, this is just to explore and respond to members' concerns about how minded to refuse is currently working and the advantages and disadvantages of our current process. Members will be aware that the procedure has been in effect over the last 10 years or so of this committee's operation, one form or another, but has been suspended for a period and reintroduced. So as a committee, we have tried different approaches in the past. The procedure was last reviewed in April 2018, and it was resolved at that time to leave it unchanged. But obviously, it's important to keep our procedures under review, and that's what we've been requested to do. So I'm going to ask Mr. Manley to take you through the options in the report.
Yeah, Sean. When I was reviewing this, obviously, I was requested that I would look at this, our current procedure, and come up with some various options. I won't run through them in detail because you have had the benefit of reading the report. The first option, option 1, is to remove the minded to procedure, the current process, and replace it with the delegated authority process, which would be basically that if members were minded to refuse or approve an application, then delegated authority would be given. So you give officers the reasons for a refusal or reason for that you wanted to approve it, and then what we would then do is take the detail of particularly with the refusal, take the detail of the refusal, and then work up the reason for refusal and put that in front of the chair and vice chair, and the delegation would be given to the director. So the director would take it to the chair and vice chair, and then they would basically decide as whether or not they agreed with that, and the decision would then be issued. Option 2 is proposing to keep the existing minded to process, but actually introduce a bit of a safeguard, not so much a safeguard, but a delegated element into it, so that at this current moment in time, everything that gets as an overterm is required to come back to planning committee for the second time. What this would do would be retaining that process, but the decision to bring it back or not would be delegated to the chair and vice chair under advice. Quite often you get decisions made by members which are very straightforward. There isn't any risk to the council, but we have to bring it back because the procedure says that we need to bring it back. So it's quite a clunky process in terms of how that works. So the proposal was to actually amend the existing process to make it more flexible and meet our needs and stop applications being delayed when they would otherwise be a straightforward decision. Option 3 is to do absolutely nothing whatsoever, and if you were to take that option, then basically we wouldn't need to go to the committee, to council, because there's obviously no change to make. And the last option, option 4, is just simply to remove the whole of the process, the minded to process, and that the decision is made on the day. The caveat I would say to that is that because of the changes in planning legislation in terms of the requirements for agreement of condition precedents by the applicant agent prior to issuing a decision, if members were minded to approve an application, we wouldn't be able to approve it on the day and work up a list of conditions, because some of those conditions may need to go in front of the applicant and agent and give them 10 days to review them. And as a result of that, the process would need that on an approval, you'd need to get delegated authority to the chair, to the director to agree those list of conditions anyway. So there is a slight quirk in option 4 in that you wouldn't be able to have a straight decision made on the day. In terms of experience, the minded to option that the minded to process that you operate here is the first time I've come across it. It has lots of merits. It has other, my report does detail some of the issues you get with it. It's really for you to make a decision as to what you want, and I can help out in terms if you've got any queries about how the process may work, but it is for you to decide today what you would wish, what processes you wish to take forward moving forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Sim. Thank you. Questions, comments? What order do we want to deal with this? Shall we deal with the ones which, in my belief, are easy to discount in terms of the options, or not? Councillor Amos.
Thank you, Chair. Well, obviously, I'll be guided by your advice, the order in which you want to do it. But I'm delighted, finally, to have this before us, and I'm grateful to Mr. Manley and colleagues for bringing it forward, because I think it's long overdue to get this matter resolved. It's been a running sore on this committee, frankly, for as long as I can remember. In my opinion, the minded to refuse option that we have at the moment, which is why my view is that it needs to go, is that it is fundamentally flawed, fundamentally undemocratic, and fundamentally is in favour and biased against the residents in favour of the developers. Mr. Manley will correct me, I'm sure, if I'm wrong, but I understand we're the only authority in the country to have this, what I call double jeopardy system. Mr. Manley can correct me if I'm wrong, otherwise I'll assume that we're the only authority in the country where apparently the members of this committee are incapable of making a decision. So it's got to come back to us for another bite of the cherry. Now, there may be reasons for that, but in fact what was happening was the committee made a decision knowing that it will come back to the next one. But of course, the problem with the planning committee is invariably, not always, but most times, it has substitutes on it. In other words, it's coming back to a different committee. So it goes against natural justice, and I'm surprised nobody challenged this in the courts, to be honest, Just as you can't change a jury halfway through a trial, why would you have a different planning committee considering the same thing? And of course, the other thing was, and this was confirmed by officers when I asked them, they never changed their recommendation anyway. So it doesn't matter what we say as a committee, it doesn't matter what residents say, objectors say, or whatever, their recommendation was always the same. So we were going round in a circle, and it seemed to me that the purpose of that process, which was beloved of certain people I know, was to get the decision reversed. But of course, in reversing the minded to refuse decision, it simply meant that the developers got the decision they wanted, which was approval. And of course, without an approval, there is no right of appeal. So it's a very important decision. If, for example, we had made a mistake by refusing something, there is a right of appeal to get that reversed, but not if you approve it. So I think in terms of justice, in terms of balance, and I also think in terms of respect to the members of the planning committee, because I think everybody around this table is capable of reading a report, listening to the arguments and making a decision. It may need to be formalized in planning language, for the issuing of the decision notice, but everybody around this table is capable of making a decision and sticking to that. So what I objected to always was that having done that, we then had to come back and argue the same thing all over again. Officers' recommendations the same, but with a different committee. And that was unfair because the members of the committee may not have, well, we don't do site visits at the moment, but they may have done in the past. So my only question on option one, which seems to be the nearest that I would be happy to see, is that it then goes to be formalized, as it were, and unless the chairman and vice chairman disagree, that is the decision. So my only question on that, Mr. Chairman, it's the technical point. That's good because it's built in that one would hope that our chairman and vice chairman would obviously honour the decision of the committee because they presumably were there. So my question is, what if the vice chairman is chairing? Is it still then the same requirement that the chairman and vice chairman of the committee both have to agree? And what happens if one of them is not at the committee, but then is asked to confirm the decision? So it's a technical point, but it could be important because I can foresee a situation whereby the vice chair is chairing and their decision is a single decision. But the beauty of the chairman and vice chairman is that there are two people there, both of whom presumably would have been or would need to have been at the committee itself.
I think for the purpose of this process, then that the fact that someone's act up into either role would not change that person, even though they may step down and become. So you've got someone deputising. You would still maintain that person as the point because. So if you were deputising into the deputy role or the chair role, if a decision was then brought back to you or the delegated authority, it would be brought back to you as chair because you would chair for that item. So whilst you may be deputising on the day, just because that may change in the future, it wouldn't for the purposes of this process. You'd still be the chairperson because you were the person who chaired that meeting and that particular item.
That's absolutely correct, Mr. Chairman. But as I understand, what you had built into the system is that there's the chair and vice chairman, and they've both got to agree, which is kind of reinforcing the position, which is fine. But of course, if there's only one person, then that one person can unilaterally just say, well, I'm not sure. And since there aren't two people there to have to agree, it's a concern.
Could we not agree that it should be the chairman and vice chairman at the meeting at which the decision was made? So if I'm not here, Pat's acting up, somebody else is acting in Pat's place, it's those two who would. John?
Thank you, Chairman. I think it's an excellent question and it's food for thought. I think that the reason for the safety net is about our committee system, and we do work as chair and vice chairs, and the permanent chair and vice chair look after the agenda management and are involved in the items. And I was going to propose a slightly contrary view, which was when we substitute the vice chair into the chair, the practical issue we have is we don't then invite a vice chair to take to the podium for that meeting. So I think in reality, what we'd be asking or recommending, and it's important we get this right and hard code this into the wording, is that we would ask the chair, the permanent chair, to step back in on that delegation. I appreciate that person hasn't been at the meeting, but they do have, you know, an agenda management function, which is longer than their presence at committee. They see the items through, you have chairs briefing, you know, so you have a degree of ownership. And I think that it's a really interesting question, and we would be creating another problem then, because we're needing to create a vice chair for every meeting, and currently we don't do that on the day. I'd be grateful to hear your views, Councillor Johnson and Councillor Agar, but I'm proposing that it's you two, whether you're there or not effectively, but it's the vice chair stepping in on the day who acts as the chair, plus the chair who wasn't there, if that makes sense.
You got a view, Pat?
Yeah, I think actually I agree with Sean on that one. We do have a long-term commitment and to more than just one meeting. So I think that's a reasonable point of view, and I hope that Councillor Amos would concur with that. Yeah.
Sorry, Joe, yes.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify the difference between option 1 and option 2. I'm putting it very simply. In option 1, you're removing the minded to refuse, and officers will take the detail of what members express as a reason for refusal and work that up and then take it to the chairs and vice chairs for their approval. With option 2, rather than everything coming back to the committee on a minded to refuse, only those items which the chair and vice chair think could have serious concerns or risk us being made to pay costs on appeal would then come back to the committee. Is that correct?
Yeah, the process at option 2 is really, when you look at when you're like myself and you come in from outside, you see a process that does automatically require everything to come back, and quite a lot of that, quite a few decisions are so straightforward that we'll bring them back, but there's no risk to the authority. And the whole point about this process was to have a check and balance to make sure where the authority was at risk, that they were brought back for members to consider. So we were saying, you resolve to grant or make this decision, there are some intrinsic risks in this. However, quite often, a lot of those decisions to go against a recommendation don't really have any risk at all. They're subjective arguments which don't run the risk of getting costs at appeal. They're an overturn for an approval which doesn't risk getting JR'd. The whole point of the reason why I'm looking to tweak it, so I'm saying if you're going to retain this minded to process, is to fine tune it a little bit for the chair and vice chair to look at it and go, officers say, well, there's no risk about this at all. And at that point, the chair and vice chair would go, okay, let's go with the recommendation. All it would do is actually cherry pick out the real risks. And then in agreement with the chair and vice chair, they would then be brought back and put in front of members, so that and members would know it was where the chair and vice chair had concerns about what they've been told, and therefore it was more honed into meeting the actual reason why it was brought into put in place in the first place.
Sorry, who was next? Sorry.
In effect, there's not that much difference between option 1 and option 2. They both involve a big role for the chair and vice chair in what happens after a decision has been made. And they both also require changes to the constitution. So I'm thinking that since we're the only council apparently that has this minded to procedure, and other councils have a delegated authority process, I think we should go for option 1.
From my, when we say you're the only authority that operates this, there may be other authorities. I haven't got complete knowledge of every authority in the country. It's certainly the only authority I've come across who operates this, and because it's unique doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. And I'm not venturing any comments in respect of whether it is wrong or not. I'm just saying as part of this process I've looked at it, and it is the only time I've ever come across it, but it's for members to make a decision. Option 3 is to retain it in its current form. That's an option that's put forward. I'm not passing judgment on that process. All I'm saying is just because it's unique doesn't mean it's intrinsically or necessarily automatically wrong.
Andy.
Thank you, Chair. Looking around the country, I see that Essex looked at this matter in 2013, Eden District Council 214. We steam in 7 years later. It's probably overdue. The reason looking at the papers for Eden District Council was interesting. There was a series of complaints, and the complaints are around the public not realising that what can be no 1 month can be yes a month later. And Pat and I have been here long, and Joe been long enough to witness, nobody present of course, but witnessed when the throng is at the back and it's minded to refuse, and then quietly the next month it's approved. And the poor old punters can't understand that, and why should they? You know, it just doesn't seem reasonable. It doesn't seem fair, especially when you can a developer can appeal a refusal, but the objectors can't appeal an approval. So I think it's long overdue. The little niceties we can surely, if everybody else has sorted out, surely we can sort that business out. The one thing I would say is it will bring in, I think, a level of responsibility and a bit of a change of mindsets, really. For officers and councillors, I mean, for instance, you won't want to see a new application which claims to be materially different because there's a few different named trees. I mean, that would be thrown out straight away. It's not materially different, is it? So we wouldn't expect to see that. But on the other hand, you wouldn't want to see this grandstanding in the safety that you can change your mind quietly a month later. So I think it would add to the responsibility of both officers and councillors. And if it's needed at this point, I move that we go with option 1.
Ditter.
Thank you, Chair. I think John a great deal went to the question that I wanted to ask, but I think she's highlighted it. But also, I think, Andy, at the end, the bit that I wanted to request that the people who come in drones, we welcome people to come and take part in this. And then when they do, they get supported, and then a month later, they get disappointment. So that scenario doesn't work. I think in hindsight, there was a planning county doing a training session, and one of the barristers who were leading this praised our system, to be frank. He said that I have won a few and lost a few, but the system is good currently. But I do have that little bit of resentment that when people get maybe 12 members support a refusal, and then the following same 12 or maybe 1 or 2 new members come and support it and put it through, which sort of undermines your multi decision. So I'm going to come back to the question, Chair and Vice Chair. I'm just conscious to find out if the Chair or the Vice Chair, maybe the Vice Chair doesn't agree with the Chair, would it come back to the committee, or would it be still delegated to the officers?
if there's a disagreement between the chair and the vice chair, that it could be, it would then come back. Am I right? Yeah,
That was certainly my understanding. It's only if the chair and vice chair can't agree with what the officers have come up with that we bring it back.
The chair, the reason I say that, I mean, the timescale is that you're given to defend your decision for an appeal, and those sometimes members come up with some sound reasonable for them, but they're not standing up in court. So I think that gives that flexibility. So I'll be very mindful of that.
Yes, thanks, John. I'm probably going to make the same point. I've wanted telepathy across the room. The point I was going to make was it's really important that the members make the planning decision on the day and give the planning reasons. It's really important that we don't, you know, this interesting point was made about behavioural change. We all need to be vigilant, again, in this new scenario. Members make the decisions. We need good planning reasons from the committee on the day, because it's not a scenario that the director and the chair and vice chair will go away and come up with the planning reasons. And again, I think it's a really good point about behavioural change. We'll all just need to think about that and get that right. So hopefully that's a note of reassurance, but just also clarity. The decision making will still happen in this room by the whole committee. But it's finessing the words that will be taken away, because of course I think nobody's advocating it, but if we did option 4 and tried to do it all in real time on the day, you'd have very, very long meetings.
I mean, the only other comment, sorry, before you comment, is I think it's also reasonably clunky and confusing for Joe public out there, because potentially we make a decision one month and next month we overturn it, and that to me doesn't sit comfortably.
Thank you, Chair. I'd written off 3 and 4 as non-starters. 1 and 2, I'm comfortable with both of them, but I actually prefer 2. It's an enormous onus on the chair and vice chair potentially, and a lot of time that they may need to consider things away. I hope that they will be given the time to do that properly, and maybe even have an increase in their fees if they're spending so many more hours having to do it. No, well, let's when there's extra information requested at a committee, because there may be something vital that we need to check out, presumably that would go to the chair and vice chair, and they would then make a decision on that new information, or would it come back here?
I had made the assumption that if we don't make a decision, if we defer, it comes back here. It's only where we make a decision in this room, contrary to officer's opinion, that we have a discussion about the reasons, and then chair and vice chair sign that off in effect, or if they can't agree to sign it off, it comes back.
Today with Catch is a good example of where the application came last time. There was some clarification over things like design. That was deferred to a later meeting to allow additional information to be provided. The decision wasn't made on the day, whereas with this new process, option 1, the resolution of the members is that the application is refused or approved, but contrary to the officer's recommendation, and then it goes to the delegated authorities given to the director in conjunction with the chair and vice chair, and at that point the decision is made. But there is a check and balance in that process, that if there was a significant issue, like there was a procedural error in the way the application had been dealt with, it came to light, then there would be an opportunity after taking advice to actually bring that back to committee.
Thank you, Chair. There are a number of things. I mean, I concur with Councillor Amos about the fact that this is the process we currently have is unwieldy. It doesn't give good customer service, and I think it confuses the public. So that's reasonable, and of course it does leave us open to legal challenges. So that said, I think actually we do need to go for options 1 or 2. I prefer option 1, but I can live with option 2. I think some of the other things around this, which we haven't quite got to yet, is our performance on processing applications hasn't been fast enough. We've got a huge backlog. We have at times been in danger of being taken over by the government inspector. Now, I don't think anybody wants that. So it's evident to me that we have to streamline the process somehow. So it's just how we do that. And I think these 2 options are quite good ways of doing it. Legislation has moved on and things happen at different stages in the process as well. And we don't want to sort of fall over the process on the way through all of this. And I think this helps us not to do that quite so much as we might. And the other thing is there are costs involved with all of our decisions, aren't there? Every time we bring an application to committee, it's 700 quid straight away. If we do it twice, God help us, you know, and if we end up with a judicial review, it's 500,000. And I think considering that as well is quite important. I mean, the cash is a material consideration in all of our decisions. And it is public money, and I don't think we should be wasting it. So I think we ought to be thinking twice and possibly 3 times before we call stuff in. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying let's think about it very carefully before we do it, because what would we spend the public's money on otherwise? You know, what would their priorities be as well as ours? I think we need to consider that. So from what I've heard today, it looks as if we're in favor of streamlining. It's just a question of which of the options, the main options 1 and 2, you would prefer.
Do you mind, Alan, if I just ask Sean 2 questions? Can we actually run this for a trial period without having to go through the hassle of changing the constitution?
No. However, members will know as well as I do that we have regular council meetings and we'll all be back together in November. And members will also be aware that we do bring incidental changes to the constitution quite regularly. In fact, we did it last time. There's often something. So I wouldn't want that to be considered to be a significant hurdle. So, you know, it would be a referral report from this committee. It would go on the agenda for November.
Sorry, there was just one afterthought there. And that is, with respect to you and I, we know where we are. But chairs and vice chairs come and go. We're not going to be here forever. And it seems to me that to avoid the appearance of political bias, we would probably want to ensure that the chair and vice chair were from different parties.
I'd assume that was the case anyway, but.
Thank you, Chair. It's the monitoring officer in me is enjoying what a chunky governance debate we're having. It's what I would say is that the group leaders protocol was refreshed in May, and so the current version of the group leaders protocol has got hard coded into it. The chair and vice chair of the planning committee come from different political parties. The group leaders protocol has been changed in the past. It therefore could be changed again. That would be a majority vote at council. I think that I would advise you to take the view that all matters in our constitution should be subject to regular review, and that any one of you should feel free to petition me at any point that you think something in the constitution does need looking at again, because good governance requires us to keep things under review. What actually then gets agreed will just be a question of simple majority at full council, but for the time being, the group leaders protocol is quite clear. Chair and vice chair at planning are from different political groups.
Councillor Ames. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just really clarification. Can I start by saying I have confidence in you as chair and Councillor Agar as vice chair, so I have no problem from that point of view. It was just the bit about the delegation to the chair and the vice chair. My understanding is, Mr. Manley, I'm sure will correct me if I'm wrong, if he doesn't, Sean Stroud will, that the delegation is to you and the vice chair to give effect to the decision that has been made. It's not giving delegation to you to decide whether it should be issued as a decision, but how. So I am just a bit concerned that if you and the Vice Chair disagree, or whoever they are, it comes back to the committee, because of course you're defeating the whole point of this. You know, what's the point of bringing it back to the committee when the committee has made a decision? We tell you and Councillor Agard to give effect to that decision. If you can't agree and it comes back to committee, all we're going to have is another debate exactly as we've got now. It will probably have a different membership. The public will be totally confused because, as Councillor Roberts said, we could change the decision. So can you just clarify that the delegation is for you and the Vice Chair to give effect to the decision? So therefore the default position is, if you don't agree, then the decision is carried out anyway. Otherwise you're going around in a circle.
My view on that is that if you go for option 1, you're making your decision on the application on the day. So it's been refused. You would only come back, for instance, because you might want to tweak the wording of a condition, or disagree on, or maybe even remove one of the grounds if it wasn't, but it's refused. Option 2 is the minded refuse still. So under option 2, it still could come back and potentially have a different result. That's what I think the difference is between 1 and 2.
George, you may have answered my question then. So what you're saying is that the decision is made. So if it, for whatever reason, comes back to the committee, it is just for clarification or something. It is not to revisit the decision.
I believe I'm correct in saying not under option 1. The
No,
decision would have been
under
made.
option, because under option 1, it's agreeing the details of the reason for refusal. So if it was coming forward with a reason for refusal, and the chair and vice chair couldn't agree what the reason for refusal was, and then you'd have to bring it back so that would, they would then be able to, the members would then be able to make the decision about that. But it's delegated so that the wording is correct, but the decision is made on the day. And it is important to recognise with this process that it does involve an awful lot of the way we being very careful on the day, and it does involve my role being very clear about expressing the risks of a development or a proposal or something the members are coming forward with as a decision. It does force my position to be much more clear on the day, as opposed to the minded to approach, which is I put those concerns in a report that I bring back. I will still bring note, if I have concerns, I will still express them, but I'll express them on the day of under option 1. Option 2, if I still had concerns, it would be through the minded to process.
Right, so all I'm asking then is just confirmation, whatever process is involved, in, that the decision made on the day is the decision. There is no provision for that to be brought back as a result of disagreeing with the chair and vice chair to have the decision revisited or reversed.
Certainly my view as chair, and I wouldn't want to speak for that, I would not wish to, if this process were implemented, to overturn the decision that the full committee had made. It doesn't make sense, does it? Because why have the committee if you're going to let the vice chair, so you have to have that position where if we cannot agree the reasons to support the decision this committee has made, it has to come back to the committee. It can't be left to the chair and vice chair to say, yeah, you're right, Sim, we'll overturn the decision. That's not democratic, is it?
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, just quickly. And as George has already said, that is the fundamental distinction between option 1 and option 2. Option 1 is clear that the decision is made in the committee, and planning balance, reasons given. The chair and vice chair are working with the director to ensure that that's correctly written up. If something anomalous occurred and there was a fundamental misunderstanding that couldn't be translated from the minutes and the spirit of the meeting, that would end up coming back. That would be exceptional. That would be very rare. because the decision has been made, the reasons have been given, and it's just about getting the fine-tuning wording. That's option 1. That's different from option 2, which is minded to still under a different guise.
Pat?
Well, I mean, that's my understanding, yes. I mean, I presume that we could get legal advice if we felt we needed it in that, you know, three-way discussion.
Can I ask about that? Because I'm concerned about the council being put in a position where we may have costs awarded against us because of a decision that was made and the reason is not sound. With option 1, we make our decision contrary to officer recommendation. Now, we've been told here by Mr. Manley that he will now have to make sure that the risks are highlighted in the report, because there will be no opportunity to go back on those. I'm a bit worried about, say council advised us that on appeal we have no grounds to defend the appeal, and we're likely to lose and we're likely to have costs awarded against us. What in option 1, at what point, where does that come in option 1?
Certainly the report would be the report you get at the moment. We wouldn't be, and if we were recommending an application for approval, we wouldn't be writing into the report, if you were minded to refuse this, then these are the risks, because we're presenting a report saying this is fine. What would happen is on the day, if you were proposing to overturn a recommendation of approval, then it would be for myself and also for my legal colleague on the day to actually advise as to the potential risks of that. So rather than being in a formal report on option 2, or option 2 or 3, which is to bring that back as a separate report, we'd actually verbally do that on the day and say, if you are minded to refuse this on highway grounds and we don't have an evidential base, it's unlikely we would be able to defend this as an appeal. However, if you wish to refuse it on visual impact grounds, then that is a subjective decision, and therefore unlikely, you know, you may win that appeal or may lose it, but we wouldn't get hit for case of costs. It's actually making sure that we do it on the day. So it puts a lot of pressure on myself and my legal colleague to actually be listening to what you're saying and very quickly advise where there are concerns.
Of course, if members require clarity on something and they don't feel they can make a really good decision without it, you can still always defer it.
That was precisely what I was going to say, is that if I really do have concerns, or my legal colleague had real concerns about this, then what we could say is, well, look, if you are minded, if you're very much minded, there are significant concerns here. You may want to defer it to allow us to get more information relating to this. So we're not actually making the decision, but the control is yours, and its decisions as whether or not you defer it or you determine it on the day is your decision. Sorry? I think one of the issues here is how we go from here. If members are minded, it's a case of how, Chair, you wish to come up with which option and the process of which option people want to go with.
There's been a proposal and a second.
Well, we have moved option 1, Councillor Roberts and I, obviously subject to Ms Stroud's clarification or amendment subsequently. Option 1, yeah.
Okay.
So the vote is to proceed with option 1 as a recommendation to full council. All those in favour?
Clarification on chair and vice chair, meaning of chair and vice chair. I'll get that wording correct, yeah.
Thank you. All those in favour? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And all those against? 2. Any abstentions? No. 9-2, so that's carried.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sean.
Isn't there a pink paper?
We dealt with the pink paper first time round. No comments, it was approved. Sorry?